Well, today we're going to be in Revelation chapter 11. We're going to look at two witnesses, God's two witnesses against the earth. And something to keep in mind, though, just kind of a preliminary thought here, is when you're looking at prophecy or even the Bible in general, not everything is always in a chronological order. Somewhat it is, but not always. We are in a very time-sensitive culture. The Northern European, the English culture, the American culture are all very time-sensitive cultures. But you need to understand how we view time is a cultural matter. There are cultures that do not view time the way we do, and actually that's often a friction between cultures, is how they treat time. And so in our culture, you know, when we say church is at 9:30, what time does that mean you're supposed to be here? Okay, yeah. I mean, in our culture, you're not walking in the door at 9:30. You're here at least a little bit earlier. If in some cultures that's the way it works. In other cultures, we say we're going to have church at 9:30. Well, if you show up at 10, that's okay. Now that drives us crazy, but that's their culture. I've heard of missionaries. The most time-relaxed culture is in the South Pacific, the islands in the South Pacific, and they'll say, "Well, we're going to come tomorrow and help do something." It may be next week when they get there. You know what I'm saying? But in their culture, they're not time sensitive. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Biblical culture was time sensitive, but not nearly as time sensitive as we are. And so they didn't necessarily value chronological the way we do. In Revelation chapter 11, John's going to see some things that happen at the 3.5-year mark that's the halfway through the 7-year tribulation. And so the first 3.5 years is done at this point. As we get into chapter 11, we finish the first 3.5 years, and the second 3.5 years, the second half, the Great Tribulation, is about to begin. But understand, as we look at that, some of what we're going to see today was actually stuff that was happening over that 3.5 years a little bit. And so just keep that in mind. It's not necessarily, we would have put things in a different order if we had written it down our way. It's an interesting passage, and we will get a little bit bogged down in details today, just because it is such an interesting passage. But this is Revelation chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. John writes, "Then I was given a measuring reed like a rod, with these words, 'Go measure the temple of God and the altar, and count those who worship there. But exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And so John here in this passage is given the assignment of measuring the temple and the altar. This is actually very reminiscent of the assignment given to Ezekiel. If you look back in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 43, Ezekiel is given a rod. He has an angel come to him and says, "Go measure the temple." And so, chapters 40 through 43 is all of the measurements. And he's going through the temple, and he says it was, this big, and this room had this size, and these are the rooms that were there. And so he gives 3 chapters of all the measurements. John doesn't provide the details. He doesn't give us the measurements of the temple. We're just told that he was handed a rod and told to go measure it. We would assume that he did obey that command, that he did go measure and he did go count the worshipers that were there as he was told. But he doesn't give us that information. At the time of the prophecy, the temple that they knew had been destroyed. And that's true in both cases. Ezekiel had worshiped in Solomon's temple. He had been of the priestly class. He was a Levite. And he had worshiped in Solomon's temple. And it had been destroyed by Babylon. They had come and conquered Jerusalem. And that happened about 586 years before Christ. They destroyed the temple. They carried away all the articles of the temple, and it was destroyed. And so Ezekiel is there in Babylon, and he knows the temple's been destroyed, and yet he sees this vision, and God tells him, "Go measure the temple." And he does. John is now probably somewhere in the 90 AD area. The temple was destroyed by the Romans, the temple he worshiped in, the temple he had seen with Christ. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, 20 years before, at least 20 years before. And so again, John is given this assignment to go and measure the temple. Well, there's no temple in existence in his day. And so my belief is that both of these are having prophetic visions of future temples. future and I think earthly temples. Ezekiel, I believe, saw the second temple, probably the one that was remodeled by Herod the Great. He had built this glorious temple there in Jerusalem. It's the one we see in the New Testament. It's the one that Jesus worshiped in. It's the one where Jesus was dedicated in. And there's, you're getting to the Christmas story, and the two witnesses come and tell about Jesus. And so Ezekiel, I think, when he was prophesying of the temple, he's telling of the future temple to come. And I think John is probably prophesying here of the third earthly temple, which is built in the last days, probably as a part of the 7-year treaty that the Antichrist brokers with Israel. That would be my thinking on the temple he measured. We're not given the details. We're not told what the measurements were. Be cool. I mean, I'd like a whole blueprint, you know. We're not told how many worshipers were there. We're just told that he measured it. Now, we do know from prophecy that there must be a future earthly temple. Still another one here to come on earth. This is Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. It's one of the major prophecies regarding the Antichrist. And he says this, he says, "He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. And the abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator." And Daniel tells us about the Antichrist, who's going to make a 7-year treaty with the nations and with Israel. But in the middle of that, in 3.5 years, keep your mind on that number, in the middle of that, he's going to break that treaty. And he's going to walk into the temple and proclaim himself to be God. We know that this will happen. He will again allow the sacrificial system. According to Daniel, I mean, the sacrifices will be ongoing, and at this 3.5-year mark, he's going to put a stop to it. Well, that stopped in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So we've got some future element going on here where there's a temple in Jerusalem where the sacrificial system has been restored, and the Antichrist is going to go in and stop it after 3.5 years. By the way, Jesus himself refers to that in Matthew 24 as a future sign of the end times. If you want to look that up, you're welcome, his whole chapter. Paul, the Apostle Paul, explains it this way. This is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. "Now concerning the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to be easily upset or troubled, either by a prophecy or by a message or by a letter supposedly from us, alleging that the day of the Lord has come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed." We've already looked at that being the Antichrist, the man doomed to destruction. "He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in God's temple, proclaiming that he himself is God." The day's coming, there'll be a temple in Jerusalem. And the Antichrist will walk into that temple and he will proclaim himself to be God. Paul tells us this is a future event. Jesus tells us this is a future event. Daniel tells us this is a future event. And so before the day of the Lord comes, the time when Jesus returns, the time of his final judgment on the earth and his final, the great white throne judgment, the Antichrist must sit in that temple and proclaim himself to be God. That can only happen if there's a temple in Jerusalem, one that has not been built yet. So we have an element in prophecy that is still to come that we know must happen. Now here in the middle of this tribulation period, John is told to measure the temple and the altar and God's people worshiping, but not to measure the courtyard, because it'll be trampled by the nations for 42 months. 42 months. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. 3.5 years. That's, I mean, you see this keeps popping up. It's the middle of the 7-year period that the Antichrist breaks the treaty with Israel. Well, here we have the 42 months. There's going to be 3.5 years where this courtyard is going to be trampled by it. The second half of the tribulation is going to be another 3.5 years. And so we see this time frame continuing to go. We run into it again here in the next few verses. Go ahead and go to Revelation chapter 11, verse 3. John writes what he's being told there in his vision. "I will grant my 2 witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, dressed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone wants to harm them, fire comes from their mouths. Man, these guys need a breath mint. You know what I'm saying? Okay, no, we won't go there. Fire comes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. They have authority to close up the sky so that it does not rain the days of their prophecy. They also have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every plague whenever they want. Well, how long is 1,260 days? It's right about 3.5 years. It is. And so, here again, we see this number coming up, and there's 3.5 years where God will have these witnesses and these worshipers in the temple, but the courtyard outside the temple will belong to the nations. And in the middle of that 7-year treaty, the Antichrist is going to come take over the temple, is what we see. Now, my thought on this, during that time, the worshipers John's to count, I'm going to guess, are the 144,000 that we saw sealed back in Revelation chapter, I think it was chapter 5. Now that is speculation because John doesn't tell us how many there are. But we know they're here on earth, and we know that they're worshiping, and we know that they're testifying to Christ. And so, to me, I'm thinking there's some parallel in there. But we aren't given the details about the worshipers, the temple, or the altar. He's just commanded to measure it. We are given a lot more information about the two witnesses. Now, the two witnesses are a fascinating part. This is one that people have fun with in Revelation, and there's been a lot of interesting speculation as to who the two witnesses are. There are certainly two individuals, God's chosen witnesses against the earth. They have great power, and they've come to testify to the evil that the earth has done in its rebellion against God. Now, this is not an uncommon thing. We see two witnesses pop up several times in the Bible. Even at the birth of Christ, there were two witnesses. I think it was Anna and, my mind goes from who the other guy was, but the two elderly, Simeon, yes, it was Simeon. They were there in the temple, and when Jesus was brought in, there's the two witnesses. You see, but this is a pattern you see throughout history, and it's also a pattern of biblical justice. Every fact in court under biblical justice had to be established by two witnesses. You had to have two witnesses. Otherwise, you could not establish something as a fact. When they put Jesus on trial, it was one of the reasons they couldn't convict. They couldn't get two witnesses who agreed to what he'd done wrong. They had all kinds of witnesses, but nobody could agree. They had to have two witnesses. Well, here God is providing two witnesses in Jerusalem who are testifying to the evil that the world has done. And they will testify during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. The Antichrist will make a treaty with the world, and God will be pouring his judgment down. But these two guys are going to be standing in Jerusalem saying, guys, God's judging you. You're rebelling. You're in sin. This is the Antichrist. You're not listening. And so that will go on for 3.5 years, and I'm sure that's going to really get the Antichrist kind of, uppity. He's not going to like it. People aren't going to like it. And they will stay there in the temple in Jerusalem, telling everyone that comes what's happening. The world will hate them for the truth that they tell. We're in a world that does not want to hear the truth about their sin. That's reality. They don't want to hear it. These guys will be calling it plain. And they will hate them. But if anyone tries to hurt them, fire will come out from their mouths and burn them up. I believe we are given some pretty strong clues as to who these two are. To me, there's really no question. I know there's a lot of speculation. There was one group that even thought it was a guy named Ludwig Muggleton. I think we can rule him out. Okay, that was a cult group in England. That he lived in London, and never mind. I didn't even research. I just rule. We're not going to go there. But let's just look at what the Bible does tell us about these two witnesses and figure out who they are, if we can. One of them has the power to stop the rain, and the other has the power to turn water into blood. Who in the Bible does those things? Elijah and Moses. That's kind of their trademark, isn't it? Elijah calls down fire from heaven. You remember there on Mount Carmel, Moses turns the Nile River into blood. That's kind of their trademark of what they did. Who in the Bible had the power to kill his enemies with fire? Elijah. In fact, you can look at 2 Kings chapter 1. The king sent out an army of 50 men to go take Elijah and say, he's up on the hill and goes up and says, "Oh, man of God, you come down." And Elijah says, "If I am a man of God, let fire come down and burn you all." And it does. Then another 50 come out and he does the same thing. Then the next 50 come out and they get on their knees and say, "Oh, Mr. Elijah, please, if you have any mercy." Elijah had that power. Who has the power to strike the earth with plagues? Y'all seen the Ten Commandments, right? Charlton Heston, the whole, okay. Moses. I mean, you can read through Exodus and see the great plagues that God sent on the earth. Who are the two witnesses that testify about God's plan for the earth that represent the law and the prophets? Moses and Elijah. Who are the two witnesses who appear with Jesus at the moment of His transfiguration when He comes in glory and in power there in front of the disciples? Moses and Elijah. And you can read about that in Matthew chapter 17. It's actually in Mark and Luke as well. But to me, as I'm looking at this and just looking at the description that John gives us of these two witnesses and knowing their biblical history, knowing that they appear even with Jesus there on the Mount of Transfiguration, there's no question in my mind that's who these two witnesses must be. They must be Moses and Elijah. And there's actually other evidences and things that we could follow and track, but for the sake of time, we won't get into that because we could spend all morning just looking at the ideas. But to me, it's pretty safe thinking that this is probably Moses and Elijah themselves, or at the very least, two individuals operating in their style of ministry. So after 3.5 years, they finished their testimony against the earth. And this is what happens. Look at Revelation chapter 11, verse 7. When they finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will make war on them, conquer them, and kill them. Their dead bodies will lie in the main street of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And some of the peoples, tribes, languages, and nations will view their bodies for 3.5 days and not permit their bodies to be put in a tomb. Those who live on the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and send gifts to one another because these two prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. These two witnesses were invincible until they completed their mission. An interesting thing here, the word for testimony in this passage, the Greek word is martyrion. That's where we get our word martyr. We saw that in the book of Acts, in Acts 1:8 when Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses." It's the word martyr. They are here testifying to Christ. They are His martyrs. And it would not be wrong to say that when these events occurred, they had completed their martyrdom. They had laid down their lives. They had testified to the very end of their breath to the truth of Christ. And when they had completed that task, when they had given their complete testimony, when they had stood as a testimony against the earth and all of its evil to point to a glorious and righteous God, and their lives had testified to God's plan, then they are killed for Jesus. That's what happens. The beast that comes out of the abyss finally kills them, and all the world celebrates. Now, it is possible, I won't tell you it's not possible, it is possible that this is the same creature, the same angel that comes out of the abyss mentioned in Revelation 9 with the fifth trumpet. Remember the fifth trumpet? The angel comes down, opens the abyss, and a guy named Apollyon comes out and he leads an army against the earth. Okay, well, he is an angel that came out of the abyss. Here, the beast that comes out of the abyss is the one who raises up and kills these two prophets. It's possible that it's the same. These two prophets are murdered because of their testimony about Jesus. And their bodies are left publicly to rot for the world to see. I would just imagine it's on live streaming, TV, internet, whatever you want. Everybody's watching. They watched them killed. They're watching their bodies rot. And the world has finally rid itself of these two witnesses, these last two witnesses that made life so miserable. And now they don't have to hear the truth anymore. And now they don't have to put up with God's judgments anymore. Now it's clear this takes place in Jerusalem, which is where the temple would be. That's where Jesus was crucified. I mean, John identifies this as the city where the Lord was crucified. Well, there's only one place. Why wouldn't he just call it by name? I would suspect that that's because Rome has destroyed it and forbidden it ever to be rebuilt. Understand that. He's in a prison camp now from the Romans. Rome has destroyed Jerusalem. They have leveled the ground. They've forbidden it ever to be rebuilt. And John is telling you, guys, guess what? Jerusalem's going to be back. The temple's going to be back. And all this evil's still going to take place. God's not done yet. But John calls the city Egypt, which is a symbol of worldly rebellion and sin. You look throughout all Israel's history, even as late as Jeremiah, they're always wanting to go back to Egypt. Every time got rough, they want to go back to where they were, back to where God saved them from, rather than forward to where God's called them. It was rebellion. The other name he gives the city is Sodom. Now you remember Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God very early on in Genesis. It's a symbol of ultimate sin receiving God's judgment. It's an interesting name for Jerusalem. We think of Jerusalem as this holy city, this wonderful place. We'd all love to go there, right? I mean, it'd be cool to see. But John here, he's saying, it's Sodom. It's Egypt. It's going to be punished. It's the evil city in which the Lord was crucified, the one that had rejected the Messiah. Well, how could this be? Truth is, the people of this world will be so excited seeing Moses and Elijah killed, seeing these two witnesses killed, at being freed from their telling the truth about God and backing it up with power, that they will enjoy watching their bodies rot in the street. And they'll throw a worldwide 3-day party. They'll be so excited. We've finally freed ourselves from God's tyranny, from these witnesses. And they'll send gifts to one another celebrating. I can only imagine in scope that this would be something almost like Christmas. If you can imagine celebrating Christmas in response to the death of God's witnesses. I mean, we celebrate Christmas because Jesus is alive and He came as God's Son. And it's a celebration of life and all the joy. And we give presents partly because we remember the wise men came and gave presents, but also because God gave the greatest present. He sent His Son to save us. But these guys will be giving presents to celebrate death. The death of these two witnesses. But get this, after 3.5 days, God likes that 3.5 right here. After 3.5 days, God's going to declare the party's over. The party's going to be over. Look at Revelation chapter 11, verse 11. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet. The problem with live TV, you never know what's going to happen. They stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on all those who saw them. And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. See, the world will watch and the world will celebrate the death of God's prophets, the death of God's witnesses. And they will want to refuse to let them be buried so they can spectate and party. But guess what? They're going to get to watch as God resurrects them right back to life. They're going to see it. They thought they were celebrating their death. They're going to get to see their life, and it's going to terrify the world. And God will resurrect them, and God will take them back up to heaven right in front of them, and the whole world's going to get to see it. And it's a good thing for us to understand. If you party with the world today, God will turn your celebrating into grief. Jesus warns us of that. On the other hand, if you endure weeping with Jesus, if you'll endure the suffering of the cross with Jesus today, you'll also celebrate with Him for all eternity. We may weep for a night, but I'm going to tell you, joy comes in the morning. God will make things right. The day is coming. We may endure terrible things on this earth, but God will make it right in the end. And these witnesses, they testify to that. They testify to the very end that they believe in Jesus and that the world is wrong and that God is right. And even when the world kills them, God resurrects them up in front of everyone. And it'll shock the world, it'll scare the world. But we need to understand we have to make our choice. Which one do we want? Which side are we on? God's side or the world's? Can't have both. I think James says to be friends with the world is to be the enemies of God. Well, it continues on. God's not done with them yet. This is Revelation chapter 11, verse 13. They see these people resurrect and ascend, and it says here, at that moment, a violent earthquake took place, and 1/10 of the city fell. And 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. The survivors were terrified and gave glory to God in heaven. The second woe is past. Take note, the third woe is coming. When these two witnesses ascend into heaven in view of the whole world, a violent earthquake will hit Jerusalem while everyone's watching. It says 1/10 of the city fell. It collapses. It'll be destroyed and 7,000 people will be killed. And I think most of us have seen the devastating effects of earthquakes. I mean, we've watched, we've seen them, just California's bad enough, but, we've seen all that type of thing. But maybe with the exception of the ones that have triggered tsunamis, I can't recall an earthquake that had a death toll of as high as 7,000. That's a really high death toll. For one city, I mean, it's almost as though God just takes one section of that city and you're done. 1/10. Here's my judgment, my immediate judgment on what you've done in this city, on the evil you've done. And I think the quake will be clearly seen as God's judgment on Jerusalem for their participation in resisting God's witnesses. And the survivors will recognize this and they will give God glory. Now understand, that's not the same as repenting. Giving God glory for something is not the same as repenting. We should need to understand this very clearly. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess. The day is coming where Satan himself will bow before Christ. It's coming. That doesn't mean Satan will be repentant. But he will give God glory. Because everything God has created will eventually, one way or another, bring glory back to God. Either because they have chosen God and they will willingly worship Him and they will become a part of His plan and rejoice in all the goodness that God has for them, or it will be in judgment. But they will give God glory. This section ends with telling us that this is the second woe. An interesting thought here. The first woe was an angel named Apollyon being released from the abyss. That was the first woe. Remember back in with the fifth trumpet and the army of locusts, that like creatures that came out with him, and they tormented humankind for 5 months. And we see that eagle soaring over the earth saying, woe, 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 and this is the first woe. Well, here we have the second woe. The second woe is an angel from the abyss killing the two witnesses of God in Jerusalem and God resurrecting them publicly for the world to see. The world is going to be in terror and grief because they're on the wrong side. They've chosen wrong and they're facing God's judgment. It tells us the third woe is still to come. What might be worth considering for us, because sometimes you look at this and it's a fun study and there's a lot of interesting stuff. And I don't know about you, I always liked biblical prophecy and I like to know. But at the end of the day, you do have to look at God's Word and say, how does this apply to my life? What do I do with this today? And some passages can be a little more challenging, as to how to do that. I'm not going to say you should dress in sackcloth and start things on fire. That's good, right? I did actually do Elijah 1 VBS, but when I look at the pictures, I look more like Captain Caveman but we won't go there. But it might be worth considering that God's mission for these two witnesses God's mission, God's will, God's plan for them was to give their lives in order to testify to Jesus. God planned their martyrdom. We know that's true also of Peter. Read John chapter 21. Jesus tells Peter, you're going to follow me. You're going to be crucified, Peter. You're going to give your life to tell people about me. Now you might ask, why would God do that? Why would God send people to die? But understand, that's our mission. That is our mission. This is what Jesus said. This is Matthew chapter 10, verse 38. He said, and whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. What's a cross? It's a method of execution. Jesus was going to go be killed on a cross. When he was telling his followers about the cross, he wasn't talking about a necklace. He wasn't talking about a decoration on the wall. He was saying, pick up your method of execution, lay down your life, you're going to follow me. And if you don't, you're not worthy of me. Verse 39, anyone who wants to find his life will lose it, and anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. Anyone who loses his life because of me will find it. Are you losing your life for Jesus? Are you losing your life for Jesus? Now, that may mean being killed for Christ. That can happen. There are churches where that happens, even here in our own country. We saw that not long ago. There are churches around the world where that happens. I think we saw a massacre in Egypt, wasn't it, this week? There are many churches in the world. If you're in North Korea or you're in some parts of China or you're in Iran or you're in Saudi Arabia, you risk your very life to gather and worship as we do freely here. And we should be thankful and grateful for the freedom we have. But understand, many people around the world do lose their life for Christ. But it also means that I choose his life over mine. Maybe you'll have the honor of being a martyr, but chances are probably most of us won't. Chances are most of us will have the honor of collecting Social Security. Understand, if you go back into the 17 and 1800s, missionaries packed their belongings in a coffin when they shipped out, because that's what they were coming back in. Today, our missionaries have retirement plans. It's a different world. But back then, you were laying down your life for Christ. The life expectancy of a missionary in their day was 18 months. And yet people went to share the gospel. And we say, well, it might be inconvenient. Are you laying down your life for Christ? I might be embarrassed. Are you laying down your life for Christ? Well, but my boss, my job, are you laying down your life for Christ? But my family won't understand. Are you laying down your life for Christ? Actually, Jesus just before this told them, if you love your father, mother, child, sister, mother more than me, you're not worthy of me. Are you laying down your life? Are you willing to lose your life for Jesus? That's the question. And we see these two witnesses who were. And in fact, if it is Moses and Elijah, understand they're in heaven, glory, celebrating right now. And they, just like Christ left the glories of heaven to come down and be crucified for us, if it is Moses and Elijah, they leave the glories of heaven, the presence of God, to come down to Jerusalem and be martyred. Would we choose that? Are we willing to lose our life for Jesus? Is every day a day that we choose to pick up our cross, a day we choose to die to ourselves, a day we choose to testify, to be a martyr, to give a witness, to point to Him? Every day should be. That's our calling. That's our calling. Let's pray.